Muna, for the introduction and the invitation. Eric and Muna and Evangeline and Chris have been really helpful in coordinating and inviting me to join both this seminar and then also thinking about the transition to join Cornell over the summer. So I'm excited, and hopefully I'll get to know many people in the room better come the second half of this year. So let me first acknowledge my co-author, Jenny Aker from Tufts University. We have been working back and forth on this project for the last couple of years, and as you'll see, it's ongoing. Funding has come from ATAI, the last funder mentioned, the Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative, the African Development Bank, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think the Hewlett Foundation should actually be the Hitachi Foundation, unless my co-author, who added that part of the slide recently, has money that I don't know about from the Hewlett Foundation. So let's thank Hewlett and Hitachi for all the good work that they do. So this project is fundamentally about, it's a big question project that we're going to try to get narrow in one case, and I want to motivate this by thinking big first and then tell you more narrowly what we've been doing. The emergence of markets for new technologies. So let's think about that problem first. For those who don't work in agriculture, this sometimes comes as news, but if you're familiar with the problems related to rural development and agriculture, the idea of technology adoption is fundamental. And by technology here, I mean lots of things. It could be new seeds, it could be mechanization like tractors, it could be new management techniques like new ways of planting to retain water and retain nutrients. Teaching farmers how to use new technologies, consistently developing new technologies and then disseminating them and getting large-scale, widespread adoption. That's a fundamental part of enlivening an agricultural sector and increasing productivity. Turns out it's actually very hard to get farmers to adopt new technologies, even when we know that they're agronomically proven to be superior to what's going on in the status quo. And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's risky. If you're cultivating a small farm and the downside risk means that you don't produce enough to feed your family during the lean season, then adopting a new technology is much more frightening than if you're cultivating a very large farm, where you can experiment on the fringes and not worry about the ability to feed your family 6 months later. There's a lot of learning involved. New technologies sometimes require tinkering, sharing information with others who are using them. It can be costly to access the finances to invest in new technologies. And then there may be psychological biases, a bias toward the familiar. People know how to use what they know how to use. Okay. So this problem, getting people to adopt new profitable technologies, this is fundamental in agriculture. And to say substantial efforts by governments, NGOs, and others to increase technology adoption is really to underplay just how much money goes into this problem, both on the research side, private extension, governments trying to teach farmers about new tech and get them to adopt. It's a big research area in my field, and then it's a big area of policy programming. So how has that normally been done? The traditional model, because it's too costly to go to every farmer and teach them new technology, the traditional model used extension. So you'd have agents who were trained in new technologies who would go out and train lead farmers or use demonstration farms. So you try to hit injection points in the community where you train somebody who others are then going to learn from. Or you use one farm as a model, and then you invite prominent farmers to come and see what's going on there, and then the hopes that the information will disseminate. In recent years, there's lots of efforts to harness ICT. So measure social networks and think about how to inject information into social networks efficiently. Try to develop new platforms that use information kiosks or phone-based extension. Harness the changes going on in the information and communication technology sector to change the way that we get technology adoption going. But fundamentally, those are the main options that we think about on the farmer side. So that's the jumping off point for our project. Lots of energy on the farmer side to get people to adopt. We want to take a different angle in this project, which is to think about the technology adoption problem from the supply side. And so most farmers, even in remote communities, they get their technology from the private market. They buy from traders, they buy from input suppliers, little agri-vets. They have their people, and they go to them to source their seeds and their fertilizer and whatever physical capital they need for farming. So those sellers actually represent a really important injection point for new technologies. Whatever's in stock in the shop is what you can choose from, and sellers often are acting as almost de facto extension agents. There's lots of anecdotal evidence to support that, much less rigorous quantitative empirical evidence on the role that they play. So if you think about that problem for a moment, what if we think about the supply side as a mechanism for injecting new technologies into rural areas? Then suddenly you realize that what you're really thinking about is the development of a new market completely. Right? New goods eventually need to get sold and priced, and markets need to clear. So what we're really thinking about here is how do we take stuff that didn't exist before and turn it into something which is bought and sold at what look like market clearing prices, where we have some understanding that the demand curve and the supply curve have sort of grown over time and reached some kind of equilibrium. The question is, how do we get new markets for new goods? So that's the big umbrella motivation for the paper that I'm going to give you today. So what am I going to talk about? With that in mind, I'm going to do a case study. Oh, Harry, go for it.
In Brazil, the buyers introduced the technology and credit.
Yes. You mean the crop buyers through contract farming and through, yeah, so that's not an uncommon model where you're in some kind of contractual arrangement and you get subsidized inputs or some subsidized credit early in the season. In fact, we could spend the whole talk just thinking about the diverse range of ways that this happens. So whether you think about them as input sellers or buyers in that market is sort of a question of definition, right? Yeah. Okay. So what am I going to do? Keep that problem in mind. We're talking about how new markets form, and thinking about the supply side is equally important as the demand side. I'm going to zoom in on a case study of a technology adoption puzzle in Niger. This is what really motivated the fieldwork that Jenny and I conducted in late 2016. Coming out of that fieldwork, that was a pilot study meant to study one particular case. We've been working on the development of some new theory that takes these ideas seriously, and then we just received a grant from the Agricultural Technology Adoption Initiative to do a much larger experiment that's going to test some of the predictions of the theory. And so at the very end, I'll just tell you for a slide or two what that's going to look like. So let me zoom in on that case study. By the way, I should have said this up front. I know that the norms here probably lean toward allowing me to talk for 40 minutes or so and then asking questions. I want to invite questions like Harry's, clarification. If it's going to take us way too off course, I'll find a polite way to steer us back. But don't be shy to ask questions as I go along. Okay, so part one. Think about this case study in Niger. So I don't bury the lead too much. The technology is going to be a storage bag. So that should tell you just how broadly we're thinking about the notion of technology here. A crop storage bag. So let me get there now a little more gradually. This is Niger, for those who don't work on it. It's one of the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa, landlocked. The key neighbor is Nigeria, so most of the population is in the south. And I'll show you some other maps later, but our study area is going to include communities moving sort of eastward along the primary population and agricultural belt of Niger. Okay. So the crop that's fundamental to our study is cowpea. These are black-eyed peas for those who eat in the US. They're the major food and cash crop throughout West Africa, especially in Niger and Nigeria. Something like 2/3 of the world's production of cowpea takes place in just those two countries. It's because they're very amenable to production in sandy soils, they're nitrogen fixing, they have a lot of attractive nutritional properties. And there's some debate between West Africa and East Africa about where cowpeas originated, but regardless, they're native to the continent. So 80% of households roughly in Niger depend on cowpeas as their primary cash crop, both food and cash. So if you were to look across the year at cowpea prices, they exhibit the same type of seasonality that lots of perishable food goods exhibit in sub-Saharan Africa, even storable, dryable grains. So what you're looking at here are different monthly price lines. This is data from the Ministry of Agriculture from the years 2000 to 2008. Each line is a different year. And the main takeaway is that the price of cowpea can increase by as much as 50 to 75% from harvest to the lean season. So there's two things to think about there. One is that this seasonality is going to be partly driven by the crop depreciation problem I'm about to tell you about. But also, if you have surplus, there are potentially large returns to intertemporal arbitrage here. Storing crops and waiting to sell them a few months later carries a relatively high return compared to other returns available to rural households in Niger.
This brings up an issue, which is, as you pointed out, you're going to concentrate on the sellers. could the sellers in one way or another take advantage of the seasonality in the pricing of the cowpeas and perhaps sell their inputs at the high price? Of course, I realize that this is not the time the farmers need it. They need it at harvest time.
Yeah.
But there might be some strategic game going on whereby the sellers could take advantage of that seasonality.
Yeah, so you've intuited something which is, I would call, a very active and uncertain area of programming and research, which is two questions. Let me break that into two things. One is, does this represent some kind of market clearing set of prices so that actually the gains from arbitrage are already reflected here? I think the answer to that might be yes, because it's very costly to store intertemporally, but no one really knows the answer to that. But the other question is there some potential, strategic gains from harvesting the psychology of buying and selling across the year? And there are interventions that take the form of moving the date at which farmers acquire inputs closer to when they have cash. And so people have been experimenting with that exact same mechanism, the one that you posited. I actually have another paper on that that talks about some of the downsides. We could talk about that offline. Okay. So here's the problem with storing cowpeas. There are borers that get into them when they're growing. That's not abnormal. But there is a very destructive weevil that you cannot get out of cowpea. They are in the ground. They're in the residues from the year before. They're in the air. If you grow cowpeas in Niger, they have these weevils in them at the time of harvest. They're very aggressive. When you talk to people, they describe being able to hear the weevils eating the food at night. There are lots of them, and there are a limited number of ways that you can try to deal with that problem. So the traditional remedies, I shouldn't actually have written existing here because this is pre-existing the innovation I'm about to tell you about. The best practices were to store these in sort of homemade double-layered bags where you'd put some plastic inside a bag trying to suffocate the weevils, to put them in airtight canisters, to bury your crops, put them in traditional bags and then bury them, which carries some other risks from rats and moisture, or to use insecticides, which then have some negative health implications. So there's a variety of things people have done over the years to try to minimize depreciation during storage, all have some drawback or other. Okay. So this bird, this is such a fundamental crop in this part of the world, and this is one of the most, one of the food staple crops that's most susceptible to depreciation during storage. This spurred a bunch of innovation about 15 years ago. A group at Purdue, at the same time that some other private market actors were doing something similar. So there's a few bags like this one that now exist in the world, but this was developed by a group at Purdue called the PICS bag. If you work on ag in Africa, you've probably heard of or seen PICS bags. They're triple layered, multiple layers of airtight plastic. They're strong. And the key is that once you get your crop in there and you tie up all three layers, you suffocate whatever is in there within about 24 to 48 hours. So some of these weevils might live a little long enough to eat a little bit of your crop, and then they're all dead. Okay.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
This is for storage.
Yes.
But is it also the correct bag for selling? Because if not, you may want to have flexibility in the size.
That's a great question. There's a few limitations. These only come in one size. Also, they are a little bit more expensive than traditional bags, and so rebagging at the time of sale could be a barrier to use if you want to retain the PICS bag for future use.
Is it not possible to combine these two different objectives, one being storage, the other one being selling?
I think the folks who developed this, and actually having now looked at this market long enough, my sense on that is that once you get enough farmers and enough traders all using PICS bags, then these just become the bags in which you sell. Lots of traders will want to put their grain into PICS bags anyway. And so I think where this is going is to an equilibrium where everybody is using these bags. It's just going there very slowly. Yeah. Okay, so the cost here, it's about $1.60. That's about 3 times as much as a traditional woven bag. Yes, Malik.
I was just wondering if you have like a sense of like losses across like the different types of storage.
I do, that's coming. Great question. Yeah, so you're thinking about the relative returns to this compared to others. Yep, we've got a slide on exactly that. Okay. Needless to say, they're much better than the alternatives. So here's our new technology. This is the technology that we want to see adopted. And when I say we, I mean anybody concerned about crop depreciation in this sector. And frankly, most farmers who get to know it love it. So here's the puzzle. This is actually what motivated this entire study. There's lots of anecdotal evidence and aggregate statistics that we didn't think were very reliable as point estimates, but were telling some kind of clear story over the last 6, 7 years, that you had very variable PICS adoption across Niger. Some areas, it seemed like everybody was using them. You go to the market, you see them everywhere, they're available, the traders talk about them. And then other markets, especially as you move eastward away from Niamey and Dosso, you're seeing fewer and fewer farmers and traders using them. There was no obvious reason. It's not as if one was a cowpea region and the other was not, or that the agroecology was substantially different, or the population density. You could think of reasons like those that might explain variable adoption of a good like this. None of them seem to bear any, seem to be the answer to this question of why there was this this story about regional variation in adoption. So we did this exploratory study to try to get a sense of A, whether or not these aggregate statistics were correct. So this was all just kind of floating in the air, this idea of regional variation. And we did a little pilot survey to first measure exactly how adoption does vary by region, and then across subgroups within regions. To also survey both farmers and traders about their use of PICS and other storage technologies, things like their beliefs about the depreciation rates, because people make decisions based on what they think these technologies will do, not necessarily what they will do. And the goal was really to question this anecdotal evidence and then to see what we learned by surveying the two sides of the market. Okay. So how do we do it? We went to 3 regions where my co-author Jenny had worked before. She's in Niger all the time. And so we leveraged some of the data that we had about household samples in different parts of the country to survey a new group for this study. So we went to these 3 regions and we conducted 2 separate surveys. The first was a farmer survey. This was in late 2016, just before harvest. Okay, so harvest comes around November in these communities. Stratified by region and gender, and randomly selected 31 villages in each region. So that's going to be over 90 villages and 15 to 16 respondents in each. So we have large number of farmers in this survey. We collected some standard stuff from these farmers on cowpea production, storage, inputs, and then also some stuff very specific to our goals. We wanted to know their beliefs about the relative effectiveness of different storage technologies. And then also we did a Becker de Groot Merschach mechanism, which is a way of eliciting people's willingness to pay for a product. It's incentive compatible. So if you're not familiar with that and you don't have an economics background, you can just think of that as a credible way of on the spot determining how much someone is willing to pay for a PICS bag. And bags like that are perfect for those kinds of experimental games because we actually have the bags with us and we go through this sort of almost like an auction with people and then can actually make the sale of the bag on the spot. Okay, so that's a way of measuring willingness to pay, basically a demand curve. After the farmer survey, we asked farmers about what markets they sell to and buy from. We then surveyed traders. Traders here you should think of as playing 2 roles, almost like the roles that Harry is hinting at, but slightly different. Traders both use PICS, they could be potential consumers of PICS, and then they also supply them. So they'll be storing grain in them, and they may also have a pallet full of additional bags, which they can sell to each other or to farmers. And so it complicates how we think about traders a little bit, but I think it's worth, for the purposes of this talk, thinking about them as the supply side. Yes?
Is the use of the badge limited to cowpeas, or is it used for other?
You can use it for other crops. In other countries, it's used for maize and some other things. It's primarily cowpeas here. Yeah.
Could you say something about the extent of the competition among the traders?
Now I'm really going to give away the whole story. Where this is going is that this regional variation is going to come from an exclusive import license that one region had and the other didn't. Yeah. So this is when Eric's, yes. We could all chat about something else actually. If no, your intuition is spot on, Eric. Yeah, that's where this is going. All right. So now, for those of you who were checked out for the last 10 seconds, you're going to have a great story coming in about 15 minutes. All right, so we surveyed the traders after the farmers. Don't pay attention to the size of the dots. These are from another paper. We need to redo this map. This is just giving you a sense of the spatial variation in our locations. This is one region. This is Doso. This is the westernmost of our 3 regions. And the study area is about, in Doso, it's about 100 kilometers north to south and something similar east to west, although it's concentrated here over by the border with Nigeria. If you move up around the top and head east, then you have Maradi and Zinder. Okay. And roughly comparable spatial distribution of the sites and roughly comparable population density, although you could argue that particularly as you get in the northern parts of Maradi and farther out here in Zinder, then the agroecology starts to change on the boundaries. Nevertheless, these are still all cowpea producing regions. All right, so let me first, to tee up the way we're going to go through this, I'm going to show you a few sets of results that begin with just the summary statistics. And the goal of this is that you want to have in mind is we want to think about every reason that we might have regional variation in usage of PICs. Okay. So first off, we just want to confirm from the microdata that actually there is marked regional variation in the usage of these bags. So let me show you the summary statistics from the farmers, and those are going to tell us a bunch of things. First of all, across our 3 regions, Doso, Maradi, and Zinder, cowpea production in the previous year, part of this was idiosyncratic. It was related to bad rainfall in Zinder. Okay. Nevertheless, it is true that production volumes at the farmer level are higher in Doso than in the other 2 regions. So mean cowpea production is higher in one region than the other. So it's possible that that's going to be part of the story. Same with storage, when you ask the quantity stored. Okay. We asked people what they stored in, so this is where we get to confirm some of the anecdotal evidence, and you see exactly the pattern that we had, that motivated the study in the first place. In Doso, storage in a PICS bag, about 50% of farmers were using PICS. Those numbers were 12% and 3% in the other 2 regions. Okay, now I said that these bags are 100 kilo in size. You could obviously store less than 100 kilograms, but if that somehow makes 100 kilograms focal, then if you look only at the farmers who are storing more than 100 kilograms, you still see 66% in Doso using PICS bags, 18 and 12 in the other 2.
It's probably on there, but I don't see it. Could you tell us something about the relative sizes of these 3 regions? Are they, in terms of population, land size?
Similar. If you control for things like acres cultivated, in terms of population density, that is actually going to vary more within than between. So some of our sites are much more dense than others because they're closer to regional trading towns. But it is most definitely not the case that some of these are the far-flung remote areas and others are the population centers. Yeah, and the sampling took that into consideration.
You see all the same prices?
For the most part, there are some slight price differences, but you're going to see when we get to the willingness to pay stuff, that actually all goes in the opposite direction. Yeah, the demand curve in the slightly higher priced region lies even more to the right. Yeah, so it's not going to end up being a price story. All right, so the takeaway here is yes, there is regional variation. Something that is inadvertently not boxed here is also this sample is skewed toward women in Maradi and Zinder. Okay, and that reflects the pool that we were sampling from prior studies. So given that the shadow prices that female-headed households face in a place like Niger are very different than those that male-headed households face, another potential story underneath here is that what we're picking up on is gender bias and access to technologies in those other 2 regions. That's going to turn out to not be the story either, but I don't want to leave that without mentioning.
But I noticed that the last 2 regions have a prevalence of females.
Yes, that's on the sampling.
Does that perhaps suggest that there's also more poverty in these regions, and that therefore the use of these storage bags is less?
It would if this was reflective. It could if this was reflective of population levels, but this is the stratification from having a sort of heavily female baseline population from which to sample. We're going to control for gender when we look at willingness to pay, and you're going to see that it doesn't explain away the regional differences. I think it probably tells some of the story, but it doesn't wipe it out. Okay. I think in the interest of time, that's sort of telling the same story. So we see this in the interregional variation in PICS usage and awareness by farmers. Oh, I didn't point out the awareness. That's the one that I should point out. When we ask people if they'd even heard of PICS bags, obviously this comes at the beginning of the interview, because then we're about to tell them about them. In Doso, 96% of farmers have heard of PICS bags. A little less than 2/3 in Marathi and about half in Zinder. Okay, so half the farmers in the sample didn't even know what this thing was. Yes?
Degrade over time.
They last about 3 years for sure, and whether you can coax a 4th or a 5th year out of them seems to depend on how well they're treated. So I think the plastic just stretches and tears, and they're open and they're closed, and so they've only been tested and sort of certified by the people who developed them for 3 years of use. But I couldn't say beyond that, never having sort of pushed the bag to its limit myself. Yeah.
No mildew issue.
No, these are polypropylene. Yeah. Yes.
And within that first question of having heard of PICS bags, was there a varied response in how they viewed the technology?
Hold that thought. Great. Yeah, so you guys are ahead of me on everything. That's going to come up in about 2 slides. Yep. So lovely. We've seen the regional variation, and it's in both usage and awareness. That's for the farmers. Let's look at the traders. Similar pattern in the usage. The variation is not quite as stark. So if you look down here at the cowpea stored in, 80% of Doso traders, so higher even than the farmer sample, 13 and 18. So once again, completely different equilibria when it comes to the dominant technology being used. Now there are other alternatives being used in Marathi and Zinder. The jugs and barrels, let's make sure I get this right. Jugs are much more popular, traditional bags with insecticides are the dominant technology in Marathi. And in Zinder, it's the same, and then also a much higher share using the jugs, plastic sealable jugs. So people are using what were the prior best practices in these other regions. The traders have all heard of PICS bags. Heard of PICS, 99, 98, 98. There's sort of one trader in each of the other regions who didn't know about them. So it's not that the traders aren't informed that these exist, it's just that they're either not using them, they're not selling them, they're not promoting them in the same way. Okay. Great, so the first finding from this is just that this regional variation is real. It seems to be more stark on the farmer side, but nevertheless, there's still wide variation in usage even by traders. So now we get to your question, which is maybe it's an information story. People have different beliefs about how effective PICS are, which is a natural question with technologies, right? And it gets to Malik's question earlier. So we asked people that. We asked them, before you try to read this, because you won't get it from reading it, let me tell you what this is showing you, and then I'll guide you to some numbers. We said, imagine you have 10 kilograms of cowpea to store, and you're going to store it using technology A. And A would be a traditional bag. And then we'd ask them about B, a traditional bag with pesticides. And then we'd ask them about PICS bags. And we'd say, after 3 months, with 10 kilos, how much is left? And then after 6 months and after 9 months. Absolutely everybody can answer these questions remarkably consistently and very comfortably, because this is one of the fundamental problems that you face as a crop trader or farmer in Niger. Very uniform responses across regions and across farmers and traders. Let me start with PICS. Focus on the quantity remaining column, so Doso, the high usage region. 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. People's perception is essentially that your crop is perfectly stored. It's very slight depreciation rates. This is almost exactly what the agronomists would tell you as well, the people who developed the bag, not agronomists, the engineers. Marathi, more or less the same, only very slightly lower beliefs in effectiveness, to the point where 1 or 2 people can move these numbers. In Zinder, also more or less the same, a little bit less after 9 months. But the other thing which is consistent across regions is that for all the farmer groups, PICS dominates the others in terms of perceived effectiveness. Okay. This is the same whether it's limited to people who had used PICS or had just heard of PICS, or even if you just asked everybody, although we asked everybody these questions, even those who had not heard of PICS. So then we immediately do not include the statistics from those who had not heard of PICS before, because at that point they're just guessing. So the point is that farmers everywhere believe they're very effective and that they dominate the other technologies, right? If you're scanning up here and comparing to these numbers, they're much lower. So not much lower, but uniformly lower when you use pesticides. Okay. Traders, it's the same story. I won't try to parse this table for you in the same way, but traders have the same thing. So there's no evidence that beliefs and information are what's driving this. Any regional variation is very small. Yes?
Sorry, you might have mentioned it, but is there regional variation in like how long they store the beans for the crop?
I didn't mention it. Up on one of those tables, there could be. We don't actually know. We didn't ask that question, but we regretted not asking it. It's a great question. And what we did ask was whether you sold at all. And when you condition on those who did not sell, which is not perfect, but at least then you know that conditioning on not selling and controlling for quantity produced, you're looking at people who potentially stored for similar amounts of time, then you see much higher PICS usage rates in DOSO. Not necessarily beliefs. I haven't conditioned the beliefs on that before. Yeah, that's a question I wish I had back. Yep. Okay, finally, price. There is some slight regional price variation. These are the demand curves. Think of this as incentive-compatible demand curves. These come from BDM elicitation for farmers and traders. All right, it's a little fuzzy, I'm realizing. And also, these are labeled by the city, not the region, but nevertheless, luckily the letters are the same for two of them. DOSO, Marathi, Zinder. The main point is that the farmers in DOSO, the region with the higher usage, have a demand curve that lies distinctly to the right. This is reflected in the summary statistics, but when we also give people a chance to buy PICS on the spot and actually pay for it with money, we're seeing markedly more demand in the region where PICS are prevalent. The traders, it's a little similar in here. This is actually a very interesting zone of prices because this is the price. This is where the prices between the different regions actually lie. And so you could imagine traders are thinking about arbitrage in terms of buying PICS from us today and the possibility of reselling them. Nevertheless, the difference isn't quite as stark for the traders. But there may be a hint of slight regional variation in traders' willingness to pay for PICS on the spot. But the takeaway from this slide is that this is not primarily a price story. Okay, so we've ruled out prices, beliefs, gender, quantity. Let's put all of these into a regression where we actually regress farmer willingness to pay on a bunch of these characteristics, because maybe little things which have been buried in these summary statistics would accumulate to actually tell the story. So this slide is the main regression takeaway. These are Marathi and Zinder. Sorry, I didn't catch that when I was making this slide. So these are the regional dummy variables. They're just labeled differently in one of our data sets. Okay. So willingness to pay, the excluded region is DOSO, where people use PICS. Willingness to pay is substantially lower. We're talking about 25% lower in Marathi and Zinder, even after we control for gender, whether you've heard of PICS, your beliefs about the relative benefits of the technology, their quantity produced, your quantity stored. Okay. The takeaway so far is we cannot explain the regional variation with any of the natural explanations.
I'm hardly an expert on surveys, but my very good friend John Strauss,
He's done a few.
doing this his whole life, seems to be very skeptical of the willingness to pay issue.
Yeah.
And I'm just, again, I mean, this is neither here nor there, but I was wondering if you're willing to defend this approach. I mean, do you really believe that you get the true, accurate answers?
So let me give a short answer, and then we could talk about it more offline. There are lots of problems with this methodology, no doubt. You have to make the transaction on the day that the experimenter visits you. And so that could interact with things like short-term binding liquidity constraints, information problems, the unnaturalness of the interaction. There's lots of reasons to think this isn't a market demand curve we would see over time. Nevertheless, this satisfies about the best conditions for that kind of question because it's a real good. I can show it to you. You can touch it. Most people know about it. They know what it does. And so you can overcome some of the primary information problems better in this setting than in many others. But I think the more important answer to your question is we're really identifying off the differences here. So what John Strauss would need is a story for why the underlying problems with BDM elicitation would be systematically different in Doso than in Marathi and Zinder. And that I wouldn't buy. So because what we're interested in here is explaining the variation, I'm very confident in it. If you asked me to invest in PICS distribution with my own capital based on just this table, I think I'd ask for more market research. Yeah. Okay, so what's the answer? Eric intuited it before. We thought we'd get an answer here. So we thought that these stars on the regional dummy variables would disappear once we controlled for all this stuff. That was the point of the survey. When we didn't get that, we did more reading, more talking. We were led to a set of papers that are not the kind of papers that we typically read as researchers, that were descriptions of how PICS was promoted and rolled out in Niger. Really wonderful to get into these parts of the literature that sometimes tell you the story that you're trying to solve in a different way. It turns out that when PICS was originally marketed in Niger, it was done with an exclusive import contract for one trader. This was a business person located in Doso Duchi who had some connections and who had a network of traders who did other things. And this was the low-cost way to get the market going. Just find one person and let him import from Nigeria. Right? You can find him, I mean, he's named in all these reports. He was known within the Ministry of Agriculture. He was the guy for PICS distribution. So what did he do? He essentially had a monopoly for 5 or 6 years. So he subsidized his network of traders. He provided them with PICS on credit and let them keep them and push them to farmers. He knew that if I can generate a market, I get to reap the rewards of it for whatever period I have the exclusive import contract, which is exactly what a business person should do and is what the ministry was thinking of when they gave him the exclusive contract. His trader network was primarily concentrated in Doso. He had people in other parts of the country, but the bulk of them were in the region where we currently see big PICS uptake. So for about 6 years, from 2010 to 2016, the only way to get PICS was to follow the chain back somehow to this guy. That's changed now in the last year and a half, and there's leakage across the Nigerian border. But what we're seeing is the vestiges of this import policy, right? And the paper I'm referencing here from Chris and Megan is a paper which looks across the continent at between country variation in technology adoption and just makes the simple point that actually the country dummy variables explain a lot of technology adoption, probably because of policies like this. The distribution mechanisms for technologies can interact with the local political economy and the capacity of the Ministry of Agriculture in ways that matter probably an order of magnitude more than our understanding of, say, the social networks within villages, if I were to editorialize on the point of that paper.
Would you say that this is a good example of the importance of path dependence?
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is. And I haven't, this is the more fun story of the paper, but Eric, where we're going now is this motivated the theory that we're now going to go test. Okay, so this is a multiple equilibrium problem. You have a sticky existing equilibrium where people know about an old technology, they use an old technology, they trust an old technology. Traders and farmers outside Doso, they're less informed, they have lower demand. Now, we know that that's not the whole story, right? Because even when we control for that, we still see these regional differences. But they certainly were even less informed in 2010 when this whole thing started. So the traders are less likely to stock PICS. Farmers have less capacity to then use them, learn, talk, discuss. So then the traders have less incentive to stock them, and so on and so forth. You're basically stuck in an equilibrium where it doesn't make sense for either side to heavily invest until the other side comes along, right? That exclusive import contract solved that problem in Doso. So this has motivated us to do some new theorizing. So I'm going to take just 5 minutes and talk to you about the theory that we're then trying to test in the field. So this is a transition point. If you have an econ background, this might be a good time for a couple questions.
So it was a good thing.
You mean the exclusive import contract? I mean, I wouldn't claim to be able to give you a formal cost-benefit analysis, but
That's the idea.
my sense from what I know of this market is that It didn't seem to slow things down in the areas where this guy had access. Maybe you could now tell a story ex post where it would have been better to have a couple of people in different regions who had preferential access. So I wouldn't say it's optimal, but it certainly did promote adoption in the region where it was heavily active. Yeah.
What were the terms of the exclusive license? Did they have to sink in marketing money into
That is in those documents. I don't know off the top of my head. Some of that is described in that Coulibaly paper that I referenced. I suspect that there was very little binding, or there were very few binding clauses in that contract because he was a known commodity who had a vested business interest in promoting PICS adoption. It wasn't an accident that he was doing this. Okay, good. So for those with an econ background, you, especially if you're a PhD student, you're familiar with papers in which we think about how farmers learn and the what's the root of the technology adoption problem. Okay. Learning by doing, learning from each other. I mean, those are the fundamental models. Some canonical papers put them together. We're adding one component to that, which is to think about learning from sellers. Sellers as an aggregator. Sellers talk to one farmer, they can tell another. Also, the experience of walking into an input dealer and seeing what's available is actually an information updating process. Okay. So if you imagine a traditional technology adoption model in which you have some learning by doing and learning from each other, and then you add on top of it some components that think about how farmers learn from sellers, and then likewise, on the seller side, how the experience of having farmers come in and ask for a good or inquire about a good or talk about a good actually motivates you to supply more of it in the future. That's the kind of model we're thinking about, a dynamic model where the two sides are learning from each other. This is a disequilibrium model. It's explicitly about the transition from not having this good to having a market for this good. Okay. So let me show you just the sort of second half of the model. What we did is essentially simulated a micro-founded version of the standard Foster and Rosenzweig 1995 learning by doing, learning from each other model, where you have your neighbors and your own experience can teach you about a good. What that generates is a curve that looks like this. Over time, if in your model you have 100 farmers, and we've set up the parameters so that it's always in everyone's best interest to use this good, and you have some time, this is a standard sort of sigmoid adoption curve that you'll see in lots of papers on technology adoption. This is our baseline case. Now you add on top of that a world in which aggregate supply and aggregate demand take into account the other side of the market. And there's going to be three key parameters. So in order to focus a model, putting a model of 45 minutes in, I know can be hard. I want to focus you on three important parameters that, having thought about this for a while, are the three places we're most focused at the moment. Imagine the time path of the supply side. That wasn't really in that baseline graph I showed you. Okay. So suppliers in the next period, okay, if we're proposing this isn't we're not claiming this is the only model of the world that could explain this phenomenon. If demand from the period T is less than supply, suppliers immediately ratchet down to that level of demand. They're not going to stock something if there weren't enough people willing to buy it last period. You could add a parameter here if you wanted to. If demand is greater than supply, so if I run out of stock, if I have a stockout problem, a very common phenomenon with inputs in rural markets, then I'm going to supply what I did last period and also increase my supply by some share of the difference. So there's a parameter gamma that is basically capturing how much the supplier actually expects to show up again next period. All right, if 100 people come in saying I want PICS and I'm out, and gamma is 0.5, then I'm going to stock 50 more bags next year. Okay.
I'm trying to think of this adaptive model within the context of Nigeria. When are decisions being made on the demand side? To what extent are these decisions based on agro-climatic considerations?
Yeah.
Let's say that the initial conditions during that period were very favorable. Farmers are willing to buy considerably more than they did last year, or vice versa. How do you take these exogenous factors into consideration?
That's a great question. We obviously, in our sort of descriptive survey, we didn't, because it was a single agricultural year. Everything was based off one realization of outcomes, and there were pretty bad outcomes in one of our 3 regions. I think the answer to your question empirically with what we're going to do going forward is we're going to try to run it for multiple seasons. This is essentially the argument for panel data and everything related to agriculture, because the realizations of the stochastic contributors to output are so fundamental. But that's almost the best I can do. I think within the year, it's pretty clear that the timing of the decision about what to buy, when you do it in 1 year. Yep. Yeah, I think that's probably right. Exactly what is going to be a period for us? We're hoping it will be 3 years, and it'll be annual, and we'll be able to run for 3 years. We think that's what our funding is going to support. All right, but anyway, the key thing here is think about this parameter gamma as capturing essentially how much the supply side believes that if there's people asking for a good, how many of them are actually going to show up next period and buy it. Okay, it's a belief parameter on the supply side. Another key thing you have to introduce into these models, for reasons we can discuss offline, is some other source of friction, and fixed costs are a very natural place to go. So there's some minimum order you're going to get from your wholesaler, some minimum level of stocking that a supplier is going to require. And that's very natural for a market like this. The demand side, there's something similar, okay? There's a parameter delta, which is the same thing, but on the other side. So delta is capturing how much of let me make sure I find it right here. If the demand side is greater than the supply side in period T, that means a bunch of farmers who normally, under baseline, on our baseline model, would be using this good and learning are not using it and not learning because of a stock out. They couldn't get access to the good. Okay. Delta is a parameter between 0 and 1 that is going to tell us what share of those farmers, even though they couldn't use picks this year, are still going to show up and demand it next year. It's like a persistence parameter on the demand side. And then something else that we think from anecdotal evidence is very real is a parameter theta, which you can think of as the growth rate on the demand side that's pushed by the supply side. This is marketing. This is the fact that I have a stack of these bags and I want to sell them, so I tell people that they're good. This is suppliers trying to create demand. Okay. In pre-Keynesian times, if you're familiar with something like Say's law, this is supply creating its own demand. Okay. So you've got 3 new parameters in this model that come after the traditional models. And this is the kind of thing that you get. So I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about these as one panel instead of break them out individually. What you're looking at here is green is demand, orange is supply, black is the baseline case. And we're calling this demand-led growth because we're imagining a world in which the good, the demand, is the treated side. This is as if a bunch of researchers or NGOs showed up to farmers and trained them about PICS bags and said, you should be using these things. We're going to give you a few of them, but we're mainly focusing on the demand side. Okay. Supply starts at 0. Demand starts at wherever this intervention sets it. And then, depending on how the 2 sides believe each other will continue to show up in future periods and how much marketing is going on, you get variation in the time paths of supply and demand. Okay. You can get a complete collapse if the 2 sides don't believe that each other are credible enough to show back up. You can get faster adoption if farmers walking in the door and saying, I want a PICS bag, leads suppliers to stock more next year at very high rates. And likewise, if the farmers, once they want it, they really want it. Okay. And then you can get something in between. This, even though it doesn't look like a standard multiple equilibria graph, because it's not T against T plus 1, this is a multiple equilibrium phenomenon. This is a market that never takes off because the 2 sides just can't get it going, and then demand peters out and nobody will stock the minimum number. This is a market that takes off really fast. Okay. Obviously, these are simulated. We don't know what delta, gamma, and theta are, but you could imagine now experimenting where you try to create demand in different ways, in a way that allows you to measure those parameters, or you work on the supply side. You start the supply curve here by actually incentivizing suppliers to stock these bags, and that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be giving buyback guarantees where we promote the inventories experimentally in different regions of the country, trying to get suppliers to hold on to picks through a couple of seasons, even if no one's buying them. Okay, and the exact components of that arm of the experiment are still being worked out. But the idea is, between these two sides of the experiment, we can estimate these parameters as well as the other parameters of this model and learn something about how this market forms over time. Okay. So the last slide I have here basically talks about this ongoing work. Okay, so this is going to take up an inordinate amount of our time over the coming years. And actually, now that I'm coming here, maybe I'll be trying to hire someone in this room as an RA on it. But it's very exciting because what we're going to try to do is interact the two sides of the market, also treat each side individually, and do it all based on a structural model that we set up the experiment in advance to make sure that we can estimate it out the back end. And the whole goal is to learn something generalizable about how new markets form, but also to promote PICS adoption, because having now messed around with this good for a couple of years, when you're in the field, you just desperately want people to use this good, because they're really great. The Purdue folks should be patting themselves on the back. Okay, so I should conclude in the interest of the standard time here. The takeaway points: economic transformation, it has to involve new markets. We don't really talk about this. We don't have good theory for it. How markets form, how the two sides learn from each other, that's what we're interested in here, especially because farmers acquire most inputs from their private dealers. Okay, training farmers is where we spend most of our time and resources. It's certainly important, but because it's so costly, and the farmers are much more risk constrained than, say, private enterprises who run agro dealers, okay, it may actually be much more efficient for us to be treating the supply side. And so the programmatic outcome of our study is potentially a set of lessons about how we should be spending our resources to promote technology adoption. And what we're anticipating we might be claiming a few years from now is that it's much more efficient for governments and NGOs to think about subsidizing the existing agri-dealers to stock goods that we want to see in the countryside for a few years, well past what they would do normally, and let the farmers then experiment and figure it out themselves. We don't know if that's true, but that's a possibility.
No policy examples of just that.
No, there are. In fact, you gave one. So that sometimes happens with the private side, right? When you subsidize the use of particular high-yield variety seeds, for example. So I'm not claiming that nobody knows that that's a possibility. The conversation is dominated by farmer-side technology adoption. And so what we're hoping to do with this study is at least shift the center back to recognizing that actually treating the supply side the way that we currently treat the demand side might be equally or more effective. Okay. We're not the first ones to think about trying to maintain supply for, say, subgroups of farmers who enter into certain existing contract systems. Or another example would be, say, national fertilizer sourcing system. So in a number of countries where I work, the Ministry of Agriculture takes on the role of sourcing the inputs for fertilizer. So they buy them en masse on global markets, and then they mix them domestically. That turns out to actually be problematic, because then the whole country's eggs are in one basket, and they're oftentimes late. So there are supply-side interventions, but it's just not where the conversation is focused. Yeah. Okay, thanks for your questions and attention. That's the whole story.
So this is about what I take to be the assumption or argument that the sellers and the farmers have mutual interests, not conflicting in this case. So I just read a study a couple of years old about central Tanzania, the cooler area, where they're growing maize. And at harvest time, when there's lots of maize, of course, the price is lower. So traders come in and buy the maize. And then people run out of food. And then they end up having to buy back the maize later in the season. And many people don't have the money to buy back the maize, so they end up dependent on food aid. And
Yep.
this just cycles. Oh,
Yep.
you know. So if those people had PICS, perhaps, and this is a question about these people, could they hold on to their crop, not sell it at harvest, wait till the price goes down, and then sell it to the traders? And in that case, it seems to me the traders and the farmers would not have the same interest in the use of PICS. Have you thought about that? Do you think that would happen?
Yeah, so it's a great point. Let me break it into two pieces. First is the presumption in the paper that you referenced and in much of the literature and the policy dialogue that something like this is indicative of traders essentially earning some kind of exploitative rents.
Yes.
Okay, so I actually shared that prior for some time and then wrote a background paper for the Gates Foundation that ended up being published in the AJAE, where we surveyed the entire literature on that question and came to the conclusion that while it may be true, there's almost no reliable quantitative evidence of traders actually earning these exploitative rents en masse. Right? And it's really confounding because if you think of specific examples, you can find them. But the story seems to be that it's an under the light post story. You go looking for the instance where the traders earned really big rents in one crop, in one area, in one season, you're going to find it. But you go back to those same traders in another crop, in another market, in another year, and you'll find they're all earning losses. So things like entry and exit rates in trading are really high. You have people earning negative losses. Most of these traders are actually relatively small, working on very thin margins. That's not to say that's never the story, but after doing that review, my posterior was that actually that's the exception rather than the rule. So what that means is that if traders are essentially doing spatial and intertemporal arbitrage at market prices, then their interests aren't really in conflict with the farmers. They're just making a sort of profit maximizing decision based on what they think they can get by arbitraging across space or time. It's not that they have some rent that they're going to then defend against farmers. And the second part of your point, which I think is completely true, is that these price curves are conditional on the existing set of storage technologies. If you find a way to, say, reduce aggregate level crop depreciation by even a few %, you may actually change the general equilibrium price story. So if you can get PICs in broad usage and everywhere in homes and in traders' sheds, you're getting lower depreciation rates of PICs, I would expect that these price curves would change. That's a hard thing to measure, but it's a very plausible hypothesis.
I think this is a very interesting example of microanalysis, perhaps sector analysis. What I seem to miss here is that you abstract almost totally from the rest of the economy. Now, obviously, there's going to be a feedback back and forth. If the economy is blooming, maybe because of greater export, GDP will grow. Incomes, including farmers' income, may become higher.
Yeah.
The demand for pigs and what have you is going to change. And again, the direction of the causality can go the other way around. The introduction of pigs, the use of pigs may make farmers more effective. It may make the real income higher, which could have an impact on the macroeconomy. So you seem to, and that's no criticism.
No, it's a good point.
There's something missing here, and there's something could be important.
Yeah.
And what I wonder is if conceivably, by essentially abstracting from the rest of the economy, your results may not be as robust as they would be otherwise.
No, it's a great point. I'm not sure we have a solution to it, but I'm not sure it's a criticism that we make enough of
And again,
sort of micro studies.
How important is the cowpea sector within?
Hugely important. Hugely important. Yeah, it is possible that, I mean, again, not being someone who studies that type of macro, I'm not even sure what the right design would look like to try to pick up on that, but it is possible, much like I said with these price curves, that massively treating crop depreciation in the cowpea sector could have influence lots of other interrelated markets. So it's a great point. I guess the best we can say is we'll think about that as we go along, and whether or not there are other things we can measure that might give some information about what's going on in labor markets or credit markets. Yeah.
When you make a comparison between the traditional storage and the storage with pesticide, and the third one is the bags, right?
Yeah.
I presume the farmers are responding to the utility of this or to the money they would pay to the bags and so on.
Yeah.
But if you look at it from a more scientific standpoint, well, when you add pesticide to the cowpeas, well, there is health issues.
Yeah, yeah.
And then when you use the bags, well, if their lifespan is 2 or 3 years, they will end up in the ground. So they pollute the soil. So
Oh.
is it a fair comparison, really?
That's an interesting question. Well, some of the traditional bags will be woven, but some of them will be synthetic. So they would have that same problem of turning into litter. But I suspect that, so one thing I didn't tell you about was that a graduate student at Tufts layered another experiment inside our willingness to pay experiment. So she has a nice little paper showing that when you prime people to think about the negative health effects of insecticides, their willingness to pay for picks actually goes up quite substantially. So the health issues are known, and when you make them foremost for farmers, you see an increase in picks demand. We don't have a plan going forward to say experimentally vary anything about the other technologies that are available. So I'm not sure we're going to get more inference about that. The idea that somehow PICS demand might be constrained by concerns about trash is, I think, going to just probably show up as some kind of constraint on demand that we don't necessarily have a way of interpreting.
Would it be possible to go to community storage, for example? What they do in fruits, for example, like specialized fruits, they store them in less oxygen, 5% oxygen as opposed to 21% oxygen in the air.
Exactly.
So that you have them for the entire year.
Yeah, the tents and things, and there are studies that do that.
Alternative solutions where you don't have to deal with bags, where you don't have to deal with pesticides and so on.
Yeah, so the DREAM study would probably have many arms in it, where we thought about some of these more community-based, say warehousing, other things that have been tried to reduce crop depreciation. The real innovation here is to think about treating the incentives of the suppliers to stock the bags. So I suspect that what you're going to see us do, not because those issues aren't important, but primarily because budgets and time will be constrained, is treating the demand side in one uniform way by promoting PICS use by farmers, and then comparing that to promoting PICS use on the supply side and both. Yeah, it's probably going to be one of those things that we struggle with the same way other papers have, that we only know something about a couple of trade-offs, not about all of them. Yeah. It's not to say it's not an important point. Yes.
Yeah. So I think my point might be slightly beyond the scope.
Okay.
But I think I was thinking like
Well, Eric was worried about the effect on the GDP growth rate. So the scope has been expanded. Very.
Well, I'm an old general equilibrium type, so I like to put
No, it's a great question.
all of the things together.
Yeah, but I want to see, Kibram's going to ask about the price of black-eyed peas in rural Illinois.
So I was thinking like, so the decision to store production or the decision to store or not to store it involves an intertemporal decision.
Yes.
And I was thinking like, have you thought about how the willingness to pay interacts with individuals' intertemporal decision-making behavior, like whether they are patient or they have. I was thinking like maybe that could be one thing.
Yeah. I share your intuition. I'm sure you're right. I think the key question is whether or not you expect that to vary systematically across regions. We actually did talk about this, about whether or not there's going to be something else about the local economy in these different regions that changes time preference related to sort of how long people plan to store cowpea relative to other things. My co-author, who knows the setting better than me, was convinced that that's not where we should sink our energy in the survey. It's still possible that we're going to try to do some of that sort of a time preference elicitation in the future. I'll tell you why I'm a little hesitant now, thinking about as microeconomists moving forward in fieldwork. The literature seems to be turning very aggressively against, for good reason, using sort of lab in the field or experimental elicitation of time preferences because of a few papers that have shown them to be highly unstable. This sort of preference stability literature that Dean and Sutman, and there's a paper by Berber Kramer at IFPRI, a bunch of papers out right now that do what we normally do in a couple of different time periods in a couple of different ways, experimentally with the same sample, and show just how fragile are the inference that we make about time preferences. But I'm sure you're right that matters. Yeah. So Harry and then Chris.
Yes, Chris. How critical is this to technology adoption in agriculture
overall in other countries and other.
The supply side question?
Your exact theory.
Very nice.
I think it's broadly applicable, which is why we're sinking a lot of time and energy into it. I think the idea that suppliers represent this underexploited injection point for new technologies is, that's my read of a literature that's been dominated by thinking about the farmer side of technology adoption for a generation. Now, whether it applies in the US, for example, I actually don't know the answer to that. And the story's so different.
This has a lot of potential.
I hope so. I mean, that's our goal with this project, is to reorient the discussion more toward thinking about both sides of the market. And then I think it's broad. Now, some of the specifics matter a lot. So for example, one of the reasons this is nice, based on our pilot work, we're almost shutting down the information side of the study. It's just people, they know the bag is good. The minute they see it, they know what it takes to store cowpea well based on the traditional thing of lining bags with plastics. So when they see this industrial strength, triple layered bag, they can tell right away, this is going to be great. And that at least is the narrative that came out of our pilot work. Whereas other technologies, like a hybrid seed that requires some complementary inputs, and maybe you've had other seeds that didn't work out well in the past, that may be much less certain. And so then the underlying parameters that I hid from you in that baseline case could be very different for other technologies, and it could be harder to generate adoption. Yes?
This might be an offline conversation. I'm curious about experimental design as you're moving into this next phase. Since is the story of multiple spatial equilibria, all multiple equilibria have to have some mobility barrier that people can't just jump to the high outcome equilibrium. How are you going to segregate markets here?
Yeah.
You get these general equilibrium effects. You've got to,
Yeah.
you're trying to intervene selectively in particular places, but you can't have it spill over and contaminate your controls.
Exactly.
This is hard to do.
This is very hard to do. So the conversations we've had so far have been trying to think about catchment areas, where we start with a market perspective and we ask, what is the catchment area for this market based on things like the farmer surveys, where we ask people, what are all the dominant markets that you go to? And that's going to require actually excluding rings of areas so that we can create quasi-isolated areas. Now, of course, spatial arbitrage is spatial arbitrage, right?
Counting on end-order segmentation.
Yes. We are counting on essentially blanketing out a buffer zone between each treated market. And then, you know, the story here is not as...
So are you going to try to saturate a few and then very little?
I think, whether we go dose response, we have to spend our money one way or another right now. The discussion is doing that, where we dose different areas, or whether we very carefully measure the spillovers. So we may intervene in only some areas, but we measure in between as well, so that we survey everywhere and we may pick up on what it looks like for these to spill out of the treated markets. We should talk more about that. That's over time. Yeah, we're looking at 3 years right now. How we spend down this budget is tricky, but the last point I was going to make, Chris, is that it's clear to me, at least, that at this point, that where we are is a model where this is not a multiple crossing adoption curve. The first crossing point is at 0, and you're seeing the kind of slow progress toward a higher equilibrium. It's just that these different regions, I'm not actually looking at a graph that shows what I'm, this is not a sticky low level equilibrium. I think that the low equilibrium is at 0 and the high equilibrium is at very high adoption, and it just takes a long time. That's my guess. Yeah.
Any other questions? I see none, so thank you very much.
Thanks for your questions.